Welcome to today's webcast, Regulatory Ethics and Insurance Regulators' Lens on Ethics in the Workplace. Our presenters for today's webcast are Laura Clark and Matthew Bjorkman. Laura is a director with RRC and has over 17 years of experience delivering audit services to large and complex life, health, and property casualty insurance companies. Laura performs statutory risk-focused and limited scope examinations on behalf of state insurance departments throughout the United States in accordance with the NAIC handbook. Her responsibilities also involve keeping pace with changing regulatory environments to provide targeted, up-to-date advice to her regulatory clients. And Matt is also a director with RRC and has over 14 years of experience delivering audit services to large and complex life, health, and property casualty insurance companies. In his work, Matt performs statutory risk-focused and limited scope examinations on behalf of state insurance departments throughout the United States in accordance with NAIC handbook. His responsibilities also involve keeping pace with changing regulatory environments to provide targeted, up-to-date advice to his regulatory clients. We're going to go ahead and jump into our first polling question for the day. What best describes your objectives in attending today's session? Please remember, select your response to the left and hit submit. A, to earn CE credits on ethics. B, learn more about dealing with ethical issues. C, all of the above. I'm going to give everybody just a second or two to take care of this. We want to make sure that we capture everybody that is actually just signing on to the webcast. Just one quick note, in the event that you don't see the polling question, again, we want you to refresh your screen so that it can bring you back into the real-time slide that will be on the live view for all of you. So I need to give you all a few more minutes. I like to get a higher percentage of attendees actually responding. Okay, I'm going to give you just 2 more seconds here. Okay, Matt, I'm going to go ahead and push the results to you. Here you go.
Great, thanks, Mary. And it looks like the majority of the group is here to earn credits on ethics as well as learn some information about how to deal with ethical issues. So good to see. And we'll get right into it here. We'll get into some real-world examples on these first couple of slides. As common sense as ethics can seem to be sometimes, there's a reason why we're all required to obtain a certain amount of training related to ethics. That reason is, even with how much we believe it's mostly common sense, large companies, high-level executives, politicians, and our coworkers still manage to get themselves into trouble and make unethical decisions. On this slide and the next, we'll get into some of those examples. Clearly, something in the culture was in part responsible for the lack of ethical decisions being made at Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo's sales practice scandal not only led to a CEO change and $185 million in fines, but the continued reputation damage is severely impacting the company. That fine could have been much larger as well. The U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau could have fined them up to $10 billion. The reputational risk or the reputational damage resulting from this scandal is also spilling over to other companies, insurers included, who had business relationships with Wells Fargo. As an example, if an insurer used them as a distribution channel, that could lead policyholders and regulators to question the impact the sales practices had on that distribution relationship. On this next slide, we cover some anti-money laundering laws and issues. Anti-money laundering laws and the responsibility put on financial institutions to monitor customer transactions has also made the news recently. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which is Australia's largest bank, is facing scrutiny from its regulators for breaches in money laundering compliance. The regulator indicated there would be an independent inquiry into the governance, culture, and accountability at the bank. Here again, the CEO announced he would be stepping down, and there's further scrutiny being made on the directors and other executives as to whether they complied with their ethical duties. Compounding the concerns around the governance and culture at the bank are claims of poor financial advice in recent years from customers. It seems like every other week there's a breaking scandal. Lately, the headlines have been focused on sexism and sexual assault, sexual harassment allegations. Uber and their founder has found themselves entangled with a few ethical dilemmas. The sexism, the stolen trade secrets, and the bribery are all ethical issues that they're dealing with as an organization. Even when you think you have all the right policies and training in place, United Airlines found itself dealing with an ethical issue when it used force to remove a passenger from one of its planes. As we all know, Volkswagen is also no stranger to dealing with issues around governance and culture within its organization. Just when you think they've finally corrected the emission scandal and paid their fines, it seems like the issue won't go away for them. One of the more recent news events that highlights the ethical issues within college sports is the NCAA men's basketball coaches who are allegedly involved with funneling money to families of potential recruits and promising to steer those future NBA stars to the apparel companies that sponsor the colleges. So what's one of the underlying themes here? It's culture. And in some instances, the culture has even incentivized unethical standards and encourages people to sacrifice the ethical standards that they have. Even having a corporate policy in place that you believe protects you, as in the instance of United, doesn't mean that you're going to be kept out of the headlines. So let's talk some more about what ethics means, and for that I'll turn it over to my colleague Laura.
Great, thank you, Matt. So we're just going to spend a few minutes going through some definitions of ethics. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of definitions that you can find out there for ethics. Our first definition comes to us from the Webster's Dictionary, and it says, ethics is a discipline of dealing with what is good and bad, or right and wrong, with moral duty and obligation. So to further elaborate, a moral duty or obligation isn't something that someone is legally bound to fulfill, but rather it is something that one ought to perform. So in order to drive a car, you legally need to obtain a driver's license. This is as opposed to a duty that you should or should not perform based on your moral values and your moral ethics. Our second definition here comes from the Agent and Brokers Education Network. And it says, ethics is an organized way in which one goes about understanding whether human behavior conforms or fails to conform with a given set of rules or customs for acceptable behavior. So this definition is very much aligned with the Webster's definition. As noted above, it states rules for acceptable behavior are akin to what is right or what is wrong or what is bad or what is good under the Webster's definition. The next definition of ethics says, it's a set of regulations that guide professionals in the performance of their duties. It is also known as a code of conduct. So what is a code of conduct? Well, that's a compilation of a set of rules or regulations that must be adhered to. In a few slides, we'll actually talk further on code of conduct and code of ethics. A code of conduct is common within most companies and organizations and really provides the rules and expectations for its employees of the company for what they're expected to follow and abide by. So what is conduct? Conduct is behavior, attitude, and character that's exhibited by anyone within and outside the working environment. So essentially, conduct is how someone actually acts, and the code of conduct are the set of rules which that person's conduct should be aligned to or be adhered to. And our last definition comes from Wikipedia, and it says that regulatory ethics is a body of law and practical political philosophy that governs the conduct of civil servants and the members of regulatory agencies. It addresses issues such as bribery and the relationship of civil servants with the businesses in the industries they regulate, as well as concerns about transparency, freedom of information and sunshine laws, and conflict of interest rules. So this definition falls within the realm of government ethics, which is the application of ethical rules within the government. But really it can be applied to anyone working within any organization, but is very akin to our audience today. So what can we glean from all of these definitions of ethics? Whether it's more of a written rule, such as the body of law that governs the conduct of government or state employees that's noted on this slide above, or the moral duty or obligation that we have to ourselves and those around us, it really is a common means that guides our decisions and our actions. Further, moral rules are typically molded from our environment, whether it be family or personal experiences or the colleagues that we work with. So later in this presentation, we'll be talking further about how outside influences can impact our ethical decision making. And Mary, I will turn it over to you for our second polling question.
Okay, sounds great. Let's go ahead and let's okay. So, polling question number 2. Please tell us which role most accurately describes your current position. A, examiner, B, analyst, C, supervisor, department management team, D, other. Just as a general reminder, you must be online 50 minutes and you must have 75% participation in the polling questions to receive your CRE credit. We've had a few individuals that have had a couple of issues today with signing into the webcast. So I'm going to give this just an extra second or two for them to catch up to us. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I need a little bit more participation before I close it. I want to make sure everybody gets credit today. I'll give you another 2-3 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the polls, and I am going to push the results to you. Here they come.
Great, thanks, Mary. So as we can see, we have a wide variety of folks on the line today, so as we anticipated. So let's move forward now to our next slide, which will talk about what is ethics, right? So ethics is knowing what is right and wrong, and it's really demonstrated through people's behaviors and values. So ethical behavior is demonstrating respect for key moral principles or values that include honesty and fairness and trust, integrity, frankness, all the elements that you see on the slide in front of you that feed into one's values or one's organizational values. Values are really the rules by which we make decisions about what is right and what is wrong, what we shouldn't do, what is good, what is bad. Again, going back to the definition of Webster's that we had a few slides earlier. Values can really be defined as those things that are important or valued by someone. So values exist at the individual level. Each person has their own independent or individual values. And they also exist at the organizational level. Values are the embodiment of what an organization stands for and is the basis for the behavior of its employees. So now we're going to turn to the ethics policy and what are some of the general requirements of ethics policies, or what do we typically see within an ethics policy. Generally, an ethics policy will start with an overview, which details the commitment that the company has to protecting its employees, its partners, its vendors, and anyone else for which it does business with. And you're really protecting them from actions that may negatively impact the organization or the people that work for the organization. So what are some of the components for an ethics policy? And you see those up there on the slide. First, an ethics policy establishes an organization's values and expectations. So this will really level set the overall values within an organization. Some policies may even detail expectation by various levels within a company. For instance, senior leadership may have slightly different expectations as opposed to those who are lower within the organization. And this is really important because ethics and morals are really set through the tone at the top of the organization. Number two, expresses the organization's commitment. So this could include ways in which the company or organization has its means for promoting company awareness of its ethics policy. Number three, it provides a means or mechanism to report possible violations. So this section would likely detail the ways in which employees would report violations of the ethics policy, as well as who within the organization, if someone discovered something unethical going on, that they would report that ethical violation to. So number four, provides a monitoring process. So this would really detail the way in which the organization would ensure adherence to the ethics policy. And this could be, for instance, such as offering ethics training or having annual certifications that are required to be signed. Number five, it identifies ethical issues. And then number six, identifies supporting policies and documents. Many times with an ethics policy, there'll be other documents that could be referenced and incorporated, such as a code of conduct or other governance policies or documents within the organization. The policy will likely also detail repercussions if there is an ethics policy violation, which would likely include disciplinary action all the way up to termination of employment of the employee. So now I will turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit further about the Code of Ethics.
Great. Thanks, Laura, and thanks for that brief overview of requirements that go into an ethics policy. Now we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly is a Code of Ethics. Well, for one, a Code of Ethics is intended to prevent a person from using their position or authority for the benefit of themselves or another. It's also intended to address conflicts of interest and the appearance of such conflicts when performing official duties. A good example of this is our president, who we all know is a successful businessman with a few property holdings. A few of those properties have been used for official presidential business since he has taken office, and some perceive such uses to be conflicts of interest. The appearance part can be hard to avoid even when, as in the case of our president, you are following policy and not breaking any laws. Laura, let me ask you a question. Can you help clarify what the difference is between a code of conduct and an ethics policy?
Sure, Matt. Great question. An ethics policy really establishes an organization's values and expectations and really serves as the principles that affect decision-making within that organization. So when an organization or really employees within that organization are faced with an ethical dilemma, the ethics policy should really be referred to in guiding that decision-making. Noted earlier in the presentation, a code of conduct is really a compilation of the set of rules that need to be adhered to. Essentially, the code of conduct outlines specific behaviors that are expected and behaviors that are forbidden. For example, racial or minority intimidation, within the organization. So both a code of conduct and an ethics policy are similar in that they encourage expected behavior by its employees. However, with those similarities will come some differences, which is namely coming from the way in which the expected behavior is assessed by the organization. So therefore, the ethics policy is more is generally more a non-specific document, really just laying out the expectation of its employees, its contractors, vendors, and really aids in that decision making, as opposed to the code of conduct, which is more rule-based and really documenting what those actions or expectations are that expected or are prohibited within the organization. Hopefully that answers your question, Matt.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Laura. And so now that we have an understanding of the relationship between a code of conduct and an ethics policy, let's touch on what that means for all of you. Most of you, as either state employees, certified examiners, actuaries, or accountants, have codes of ethics you must follow and in some cases are even codified in state statutes or rules. So let's go into a few examples. Here's an example from Florida state statutes, which is an example of the high ethical standards we're expected to hold ourselves to. Let me highlight some key points from this standard. Public officers and employees are bound to uphold both the U.S. and state constitution and to perform efficiently and faithfully their duties under the laws. They are bound to observe in their official acts the highest standards of ethics consistent with this code, regardless of personal considerations. They are bound to promote the public interest, and maintaining the respect of the people in their government must be of foremost concern. So let's recap the important pieces here. The highest standard of ethics, regardless of personal considerations. Promote public interest and maintain respect of the people is foremost concern. How this is achieved will be covered in some later slides on the ethical framework. Connecticut has an Office of State Ethics that practices and promotes the highest ethical standards and accountability. There are separate codes of ethics for public officials, lobbyists, and those bidding on state contracts. These codes cover everything from how often you have to take a training like this one, to dollar limits on gifts, to how ethical concerns should be communicated or reported, to how grievances will be handled, and also outlines the duties of state ethics compliance officers. As Laura noted earlier, an ethics policy can identify other policies and supporting documents as well. Here, the New Jersey Department of Banking and Insurance has a supplemental code of ethics. Again, what this stresses is as public officials, we must avoid conduct that is in violation of public trust or which creates a justifiable impression among the public that such trust is being violated. But as you'll note at the bottom of the slide, and I know the print is very small, the state's Uniform Ethics Code is the primary code of ethics for all state employees. So this supplemental code of ethics only applies to employees of the department who must be aware of both sets of standards. Even with the high ethical standards expected of public officials, there are also other organizations you might be associated with that have separate ethical standards. This slide only highlights a few, like SOFE, CPA organizations, and actuarial organizations. All will be different to some extent with whom they are designed to protect, but in the end, it's about upholding the responsibility that comes with having that designation. Now let me turn it over to Mary, who's going to cover polling question number 3 for us.
Okay, this is a big one. Have you been faced with an unethical question in the last year? A yes, B no. I'll give everybody a few seconds. give it a few more. I have had a few people say they weren't able to catch the polling question, so I apologize that I'm taking just a few seconds longer. I want to make sure that everybody gets in their answer. For those individuals that did have a couple of issues when you first signed on, we do have a few more, so you will be able to meet the minimum requirement. It will require you to attend the whole webinar. Okay, so I think I have a good response here for you. I'm going to go ahead and push your answer to you. Here it comes, and close the poll. There you go.
Great, thank you, Mary. So as you can see on the slide, about 38% of the folks on the line have been faced with an ethical decision in the last year, and the other 61% have not. So for those who have not, you may in the future, and for those of you who have, the next section should be really on point. We're going to be going through the ethical framework, and there's really a framework for how to consider and think through when you are faced with an ethical dilemma. Just to say, the following slides are from the University of Texas Ethics Unwrapped program. And this is an extensive resource that's available to the public free of charge on the University of Texas website. So before we jump into talking about the ethical framework, let's just talk a little bit about, what are some of the common characteristics of an ethical issue? And there could be a lot, but first of all, it's not easy. It's not an easy topic to deal with and to think through. Most ethical issues are not going to be black and white. Most will fall into the gray zone and will really take a lot of diligence in thinking through. Most ethical issues are going to be of a personal nature. They could also be the stakes could be high with those issues, right? And we're going to be talking about in a few slides that sometimes ethical issues are so severe that they may land you in jail or on the front page of the paper, just to highlight some of the issues that Matt spoke to at the beginning of the presentation. And working through an ethical dilemma could be very confusing as well. And that's why we're going to talk about this ethical framework, which is a 4-step process that gives us a way to think through an ethical issue. And like I said, ethical questions and issues come in all shapes and sizes. There's no one-size-fit-all magical formula solution to reaching the appropriate or moral conclusion or decision. So the 4 steps to the ethical framework are on the slide here, beginning with moral awareness, moral decision-making, moral intent, and moral action. And we're going to talk about each of these in the next few slides. So beginning with moral awareness. So moral awareness is recognizing ethical issues when you see them. But you have to understand it's not always easy to do this. So you may see unethical behavior all around you, and this may make it even more difficult or challenging for you to stick with your moral values and to really follow what you think is right. But regardless of those elements that are around you, it is important to recognize ethical issues when you see them or when you're faced with them. There's always an ethical dimension to all decisions that we make. In some ways it just may be so obvious that it's not so much of an issue, but a lot of times it could be in that gray zone. So it's really important that we're paying attention to these. So let's think about the old adage. If you were to put a frog into a pot of boiling water, immediately it's going to jump out. But if you were to put a frog into a pot of cold water and slowly let it heat up, that frog is going to be caught off guard and not realizing right away maybe that water is heating up. So this is really a good analogy for where we fail to notice where ethical standards could be eroding away. So in certain circumstances, you may find minor infractions or a minor decision that may be a little unethical, maybe become acceptable. And the more that you consider that, it could get to the point where something is creeping along, becoming more and more in the black zone or in the gray zone, and something may be considered a significant unethical decision that at that point might not seem so egregious. So again, why we need to be aware of our moral awareness. So on this slide here just shows a few barriers to seeing ethical issues. So studies have shown that people really see what they want to see, and they may not be able to see ethical issues. And some examples as to why this is are due to, one, you want to please authority. You want the expectation of your boss. You want to make your boss happy. Or two, you want to fit in with the group. You want to follow the crowd. You want to, if they're doing it, you might say, well, why can't I? It can't be that bad. Or three, you're blinded by a bonus or a quota. So you know that you have to meet a certain hours target, and you want to make sure that you're meeting that target because that's what's going to get you your bonus. However, it's important not to be blinded by these barriers to seeing ethical issues. You may look around and see others maybe charging some additional hours to a client, but you should, recognize and know that that is not ethical behavior. So always keeping, ethics in your frame of reference is important. So when you're faced with a moral issue, what are a few things you can do? First, take a few seconds to pause and reflect upon the issue. Don't immediately jump into making a decision. I would say most importantly, listen to your gut or your inner voice. Don't ignore those ethical issues. Your inner voice may not always be right, but it would be foolish not to listen to it. And it is that inner voice that is your moral awareness awakening and indicating to you that a decision may not be the right decision. And then lastly, would you be comfortable explaining this decision, whether it be to your spouse or a colleague or another confidant, and working through your decision making? Would they agree with your decision as to whether it was ethical or not? So step number 2 in the ethical framework is moral decision making. And moral decision making is the ability to decide upon the right course of action that is ethical. So finding a solution is going to be difficult in certain instances, and in many cases there could be many possible solutions to any decision. And all of those decisions, may not be black and white again. They could be in the gray zone. So you really need to spend the time to consider which is the right decision, which is the best decision. And it could be at times that none of those choices seem right, and then you have to consider other alternatives in making your decision. So, as we just talked about, sometimes there is a clear right or wrong answer, and sometimes there is not. For instance, of what's up on the slide here, insider trading or cheating on your taxes are obviously wrong. They don't present moral dilemmas. They are just wrong. And additionally, they could also land you in jail. But typically we could be unaware of many of the influences that bias our gut decision or our inner voice. And these influences could be organizational or societal or even religious influences. We can easily rationalize to ourselves why a decision may be the appropriate answer at that time. And this is known as the self-serving bias. And the self-serving bias really causes us to see things in a way that would support our best interests or blind us to unethical behavior. So, for instance, and hopefully that's not happened to anyone, but if you're involved in a car accident, right? So if you were the one who got rear-ended, you would likely believe that the person that hit you should pay for all of your repairs and all of your medical bills. But in an instance where you ended up rear-ending someone, you may find reasons for why you do not need to pay for all of their expenses or their medical bills. So in this very simple example, it illustrates the sense of, self-bias or support for our best interests and how that can influence our decision-making. And therefore, that's really why it's important for us to engage in objective decision making. And if we do that, others will see our decisions in the same light that we do. Others will have a sympathetic eye to our decisions, and that this is what's going to help us overcome that self-serving bias, or a way in which our decision making is kind of blinding us to unethical behavior. And lastly, just to point out, it's really important that we pay attention to ethical policies and codes of conduct, as these are really designed to minimize conflicts of interest.
Laura, this is Matt. A quick question for you.
Sure.
Can the self-serving bias negatively impact a company's performance?
Absolutely, Matt. Recall that the self-serving bias allows us to see things in the best way to support our own interests. Even from the beginning of the presentation, and you were going through the real life examples that are out there, many of these people made their decisions for their own best interests or the best interests of the company, such as Wells Fargo, which at the end of the day did negatively impact that company's performance.
Thanks.
Sure. So moving on to step number 3 of the ethical framework, and this is moral intent. And moral intent is the desire to do the right thing. There's always that line in between where a person will stop justifying a decision to themselves and where they actually realize it's not morally ethical. And it's key to find this line and to recognize it, and then to know that you need to act and specifically identify a decision that adheres to your values and to your ethics. So, while we may have the desire to do the right thing, we have to recognize that we may be able to rationalize to ourselves to do the wrong thing. And this ability to rationalize is the single biggest way in which good people give themselves the license to do bad things. Often people can justify any rationale for why a decision is appropriate, even if it goes against their moral values or they're not listening to their moral awareness. Folks can easily ignore their gut and make an immoral decision. And this is very obvious from a lot of the examples that Matt highlighted at the beginning of this presentation. Therefore, to preserve our moral intent, we need to make sure that we're monitoring our own rationalizations. So this slide highlights some of the ways in which people can rationalize making a bad decision. So the first one is denying responsibility. Simply saying someone else made you do it and you had no choice but to make that decision. All you're simply doing in this instance is just shifting responsibility to someone else to justify your own bad decision. The second way to rationalize is no injury. So this is basically saying that the harm is expected to be small, so our decision doesn't seem so bad. So if you decide, I'm just going to book a few extra hours and we'll bill a client for a few more dollars, but that way I'll reach my hours target, it's rationalizing a bad decision. The third one on the slide is the victim deserves it, essentially based on what somebody did in their past misdeeds. You're using that as your rationale for making your bad decision now. The fourth one is social weighting, and this is basically justifying that the act is not nearly as bad as what other firms or what other people are doing. So all you're doing is weighing your own bad actions against people who are making, in your mind, even worse decisions than what you're making now. The fifth one is appealing to a higher loyalty, and we talked about this earlier, is, well, you had to make the decision because you had to do it for your firm or your boss or your department. And the last one on the slide is justified by past treatment. So if you feel that you deserve something and that you did not get that, such as a promotion, or you're not getting paid overtime, or you're paid too low for the work that you do, basically you're just not feeling valued. However, in each of these situations, the alarm bells should be going off. And rationalizing a bad decision here would be going against your moral awareness. So it's important just to talk out your own rationalizations, especially with someone you trust or are confident, somebody who is not involved in this situation or in the dilemma that you're facing. And this will really enable you to preserve your moral intent. So what are some common excuses? You'll see them up on the slide here. My boss told me to do it. If I don't do it, I know I'm going to lose my job. Or following the crowd. Everybody does it. Why shouldn't I? The organization won't notice. All of these are just common excuses. These are not sufficient reasons. So really making sure that we are appropriately rationalizing and using this framework and listening to our gut and making our moral decision making. So now I will turn it over to Mary for polling question number 4.
Okay. What is moral intent? A, desire to do the right thing. B, recognize ethical issues when you see them. Give you all a few moments to answer this. I would also like to remind everybody that if you have a question that you would like to submit to Laura and Matt, you can do so in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. You may no longer see it, but rest assured it is available to us. Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good crowd answering, so I'm going to give you all about 2 more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll and push the results out to you. We have a few minute last second, people. Okay, so the submissions have stopped, so I'm going to go ahead and push the results to you. Here they are.
Great, thanks, Mary. So the correct answer is A, which most of the folks on the line did answer, and it is the desire to do the right thing. But as discussed, sometimes we can rationalize to ourselves why we choose to do something that it might not be ethical. If you do recall answer B, recognizing ethical issues when you see them would be your moral awareness. So now we'll hand it back over to Matt to talk about step 4 of the ethical framework.
Great, thanks, Laura. So Laura has just covered the first 3 parts of the ethical framework, which included moral awareness, moral decision-making, and moral intent. The 4th and last part of the ethical framework is moral action. Moral action is being able to act on that intent. Said another way, it is the motivation and action upon the desire. Moral action can be difficult to take because of expected consequences and reactions that are possible. On the next slide, we'll touch on some of the considerations for applying moral action. Moral action is comprised of 3 pieces. First is moral ownership, and we take moral ownership when we feel psychologically responsible over the ethical nature of our action and those around us. Second is moral efficacy. Moral efficacy is the belief that we can act ethically and induce others in the face of adversity. This is the power of one, the belief that one person can make a difference. Let's go over an example. Management sets a standard of ethical conduct for other employees to follow, and when those administrators adhere to the code of ethics, it sends a message that universal compliance is expected of every employee. So while some may not have the courage to lead, they may have the courage to follow, and you can be that leader. Again, the power of one. Lastly is moral courage. Moral courage is your commitment to moral principles, a recognition of the danger involved, and willingness to take it on. So let's talk a little bit about how ethical standards are developed. There's 4 different approaches that we're going to cover here. The first approach is the utilitarian approach, which, like in practicing medicine, you embrace the do not harm concept. The goal is to produce the greatest good and the least amount of harm. This approach looks at consequences and what behavior will produce the greatest benefit and the least amount of harm. The next approach is the fairness or justice approach. This approach considers that all people should be treated equally or fairly based on a defensible standard. Third, we have the common good approach. In the common good approach, decisions are made based on improving the welfare of everyone. Police and fire departments, public education, recreation, and healthcare are often created based on the common good approach, or rather the common good approach is used in trying to achieve the balance needed. Lastly is the virtue approach. A virtue approach answers the question, what kind of person will I become if I do this? It looks at what behaviors bring out the highest potential in people. These would include virtues such as truth, honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, integrity, fairness, self-control, prudence, etc. Now let's go over a few things that ethics is not. Being ethical does not mean following your feelings. Your feelings can misdirect you. Being ethical can be related to religious beliefs and can motivate people to act ethically, but every person can behave ethically even if they don't have any specific religious beliefs. Being ethical is not the same as following the law. In most cases, the law is derived from ethical standards. However, behaving ethically may require doing more than the law demands. Being ethical is not necessarily behaving in a way that society or your organization finds acceptable. Sometimes societal or organizational norms get out of whack, such as with some of our earlier current events discussed. Being ethical is not simply doing what is right either, because what is right in the eye of the beholder. Two people can be faced with the same situation and make 2 different decisions about how to behave, and both claim they were doing what is right. Ethics can be managed and trained. However, an organization needs to specifically communicate its expectations and standards of behavior. As we've mentioned, each state has its own ethical standards, but here are some general items to be mindful of. A regulator should be mindful not to accept or solicit any gift, favor, or service that might reasonably tend to influence. They should not accept other employment or engage in a business that would involve the disclosure of confidential information. A regulator should be mindful not to accept other employment that could impair an independence or of judgment. They should be mindful not to make personal investments that could create a conflict with public interest. And lastly, they should not intentionally or knowingly solicit, accept, or agree to accept any benefit for exercising official powers or duties. So what do we do if an ethical issue arises? When faced with an ethical issue, or even one that potentially could be one, asking the right questions helps. You want to understand the facts and not be biased from outside influencers. Understand who is involved and the different ethical standards that apply to each party. Laying out the situation and identifying the possible solutions will assist you in making the right ethical decisions. Having an idea of the best or worst case scenarios will also help in understanding the possible solutions and what your final recommendation will be.
Matt, I just had a quick question for you. We did talk about briefly conflicts of interest earlier in the presentation, but can you elaborate a little bit how conflicts of interest play into ethics?
Certainly. Thanks, Laura. A conflict of interest arises when we have incentives and responsibilities in our personal and professional lives that are conflicting. They can be real, potential, or even just appear to be conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest can stem from relationships with family members. They can be caused by financial interests, or even come up because of outside employment. For instance, as a regulator, if you're offered tickets to a baseball game from an insured you're regulating, most regulators are subject to prohibitions on the acceptance of gifts. Accepting these tickets would not only be a conflict of interest, but also potentially against your ethical standards if it's against your state's policy. Conflict of interest occurs when you promote a private interest and it interferes with the objective exercise of your duties. When faced with conflicts of interest, you would take all appropriate steps to remove yourself from the situation and report the situation to the appropriate personnel. So I believe that brings us to our last polling question. And so, Mary, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Matt. What do you do if an ethical issue arises? A, nothing. B, think about the issue but keep to yourself. C, question. I'll go ahead and give everybody just a few seconds here. Like Matt advised, this is our last polling question, so I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get this answer in. So I will give you all a little time on this. Okay, it looks like they're coming in a little bit slow, but 1 or 2 more seconds, and then I'll push out the results to you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the polls and push out your results to you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Mary. Question. That is correct. Like we just talked about, make sure you get all the facts together, lay everything out, and as Laura mentioned in one of her earlier slides, have that person that you're confident that you can go to and bounce theoretical scenarios off of in order to help you in your ethical decision making. As we wrap up here, let me just briefly summarize some of the key points we covered today. Training such as this one are important. As we noted, there's plenty of examples where people or organizations make unethical decisions. There's various rules or codes that regulators are expected to adhere to, whether it be state codes of ethics, ethics policies, other codes of conduct, etc. These guidelines set expectations for the people that work within those organizations or the state departments. It's also important to recognize that ethical decision-making is not easy and it can be confusing. The decision may be black or white, or it may be more in that gray zone. That's why using the ethical framework as a guide is important to thinking through these ethical decisions. Don't fall into the trap of making excuses for bad behavior. Instead, follow your gut to help you with your decision-making, what we refer to as moral awareness. Make sure to question when an ethical issue arises and understand all of the facts. Lastly, we mentioned some ways in dealing with unethical people. We hope that this training has been informative and has provided you with some useful tips that you may, for when you may next be faced with an ethical issue.
Great, thanks, Matt, for that summary. As we have about 2 minutes left, we did have one question that I will cover. And that question is, if we come across unethical behavior, what are some of the considerations that we need to be aware of? So, in dealing with unethical behavior can be an extremely difficult and challenging situation, especially if that person is your boss or a superior. So in all cases, make sure that you have all of your facts in order. This is what Matt talked about on a few slides previously. Suggest that you include all documentation, if possible, when reporting a violation, really the evidence piece of that. Make sure that you have firsthand knowledge. Don't base your claims or accusations off any hearsay. Make sure that you can substantiate your position. And if that unethical person is your boss, there's always safety in numbers. So make sure that you get other folks on your side if you decide to go report an unethical behavior on behalf of your boss. And so we will just turn it over to Mary now just to go over some remaining administrative requirements for CE credits.
Okay, thank you, Laura and Matt. I'm going to go ahead and push this one slide back out to you all. And for anybody that was unable to answer a question during today's webcast or would like to contact Laura and Matt, we're displaying their contact information on the screen for you. Or you may send your name and number to the Q&A manager, and I will be happy to forward it to them. But a few reminders before we conclude. To receive a copy of today's presentation or to submit questions, please send a request to reply@riskreg.com. Group sign-in forms and participant evaluations should be submitted within 24 hours of the event's conclusion. As a reminder, both forms are available in the resource panel to the right of your screen, and instructions for submission are included on those forms. It's very important to us to receive feedback from our participants as we move through our 2017 webcast series. Please take a moment to provide feedback on today's presentation by completing the attendee survey in that resource list that's to the right of your screen. All unanswered questions will be addressed via email following today's event. Eligible participants will receive 1 CRE credit for attending today's event within 30 days. On behalf of all of us at RRC, thank you for attending. This concludes today's event.